Hello, everybody. My name is Ray. Welcome to the Evangelical Dark Web. Today, we're going to be discussing Megan Basham's new book, Shepherds for Sale, and we're going to be giving an official review of it for the channel right here, right now. And overall, this is a very good book. I think this book coming out is one of the top 10 stories of evangelicalism this year. And I also think this might also be Book of the Year. And that's with this upcoming announcement that my book is now available for pre-order, Winning Not Winsome, 10 Commandments of Spiritual Warfare, which comes out next month, September 10. And it's now available for pre-order. The price, you can't quite see it here, is $17.99. I did not make the price, my publisher did. But that is now available for pre-order. This is such a great announcement that I'm happy to make. It is very similar to Megan Basham's book. It's also very similar to Andrew Isker's book, The Boniface Option. And if those two books got crossbred together, my book would probably be the product, of the merger. Because it's very much stylistically in between those two. If you like both of those books, or even one of those books, I think you'll like Winning Not Winsome. So anyway, that's not what we're going to talk about. We got a huge review to do, and I think the best way to do that will be to do a ranking of the chapters from least favorite to favorite, because that's the most fun way to do it. Let me first get my biggest criticism with the book. Now, there's a couple of factual errors. She says something about the money that this organization received in 2018 when World Relief, I believe it was, and it was a much longer span. So that's a type of error, but it is an error nonetheless. And then she claimed that two people who went to a Southern Baptist theological seminary were PCA educated, which isn't true. There's a lot of people in the PCA that are affiliated with the Revoice movement, pushing side B theology, but the two that were specifically mentioned in that point were not PCA seminarians. It's an instance of right point, wrong evidence. But my biggest criticism of the book is that Megan Basham seems to do the whole equality versus equity thing. Both of these are very liberal phenomenons, by the way. When I was growing up, equality was a liberal buzzword, and then conservatives argued that equity was what we wanted. And then that flipped sometime around 2019, 2020. That flipped, and now equity was the liberal buzzword, and equality is what conservatives are all of a sudden championing after decades of equality being that liberal buzzword. So Megan Basham does fall into that. She does fall for that, and that's my biggest gripe with the book. Both of those are bad. Like, I don't think it's not biblical in my position for equality of outcomes. That's not biblical at all. God does not promise that whatsoever. Even for the saved, he does not necessarily promise equal rewards in heaven. And then, or equal punishments in hell for that matter. But equality of opportunity isn't, necessarily biblical either, because some people have better starting positions than others. And you can't really give people an equality of opportunity. That's not really a thing. You can have equality under the law where a king and a peasant have the same legal treatment and status. That's a good thing. But equality of opportunity, which is sort of championed by Megan Basham, that to me is not a biblical ideal. So anyway, let's get into my list of the top chapters, least favorite to favorite. We're going to do the 8 chapters. We're not going to talk about the introduction or the conclusion. The conclusion's pretty interesting. It's compelling. It's an autobiographical recounting of Megan Basham's life, so I really liked it. But for the purposes of this review, we're going to talk about the chapters, the meat of the book. And as a disclaimer, I do Christian news gathering and commentary, so I am very much informed on most of this book. So that is going to inform my ranking of these chapters. How much am I surprised by? How much is ho-hum? So keep in mind my biases going into this book. This book did find ways to impress me, but the first chapter, or the in my opinion, my least favorite chapter was chapter 6, Critical Race Prophets, which talks about critical race theory and the influence in the church that had. To be honest, this isn't necessarily the best book on critical race theory. Megan Basham doesn't really try to get into that issue on a technical level a whole lot. But nonetheless, this was a lot of stuff I already knew. No real surprises to me. I didn't really take down any notes from this chapter. So it's kind of my least favorite chapter. Number 7, I would rank chapter 3, Hijacking the Pro-Life Movement. There's 8 chapters, by the way, in the meat. Hijacking the Pro-Life Movement. Again, this is another chapter where I kind of knew it all already. It talks a lot about people like Karen Swallow Pryor, and how she, was trying to push Baptist and evangelicals in a liberal direction on abortion, trying to get evangelicals to expand the definition of pro-life to include quality of life issues, and then the reluctance to celebrate the Dobbs decision for the wrong reasons. So that to me is my second least favorite chapter. So rank number 6, illegal immigration, strangers, neighbors, and aliens. This is chapter 2 in the story. This is one of the most important chapters. The idea that evangelicals have been targeted by big money donors, specifically George Soros, in this chapter to advance an amnesty agenda is huge. One of the things that's pretty interesting, a lot of this I've covered in the past, such as the Evangelical Immigration Table. This is a story from 2013 or 2012 maybe, during the Gang of Eight crisis in the Senate. And it rehashed itself in the 2020 when the Baptist press lied about, the Evangelical Immigration Table. They lied about it. They peddled a hoax about it. And Megan Basham calls that out, rightfully so. I called it out at the time, by the way. So again, this chapter wasn't all that surprising. It does give Eric Metaxas a little bit of leniency for falling in and then, correcting himself. So that's kind of an interesting happening that happened in that chapter. But it did not surprise me a whole lot. It covered a lot of things I've already known and talked about. Number 5, my 5th most favorite chapter from Megan Basham's Shepherds for Sale is Christian Media and the Money Men. This chapter goes into Christianity today for the most part. It talks about the corruption of Christian media. And Christianity Today is the most prominent example. It talks about the donations to liberal candidates from Christianity Today. It talks about a host of other things. But this chapter really resonates with me because I feel a kindred spirit in Megan Basham here, because one of the reasons why I launched Evangelical Dark Web was because of the corruption in Christian media. And one of the things that I cover a lot on evangelicaldarkweb.org, sign up for a free newsletter, by the way, is the corruption of evangelical media. I talk about Christian Post, Gospel Coalition, and then obviously Christianity Today. I've talked about them twice in the last 2 weeks for their corruption. So this is right in my wheelhouse. I really resonated with this chapter. Number 4, Me Too. It's chapter 7. Me Too, Church Too, and an Apocalypse. This is a deep dive on the corruption of Christian media, in fact. Charisma Magazine is heavily called out in this chapter for their Me Too reporting, which made it seem like John Krista's sexting scandal was, he was victimizing these women. Now he might have been a sleazy guy, but was he abusive? Charisma Magazine did not provide the receipts. They did not provide the text messages to show that he was an abuser. So a lot of issues going on in Christian media, and the fact that evangelicalism bought hook, line, and sinker into the Me Too agenda, which Megan Basham has exposed in the past. And I've known a lot about these scandals in the past as well, but there were some new aspects that even I am impressed by. She just exposes J.D. Greear for his hypocrisy on this issue, exposes Kevin Ezell for his hypocrisy on this issue, including a story about how he, was suing a journalist for, or threatened to sue a journalist for libel to protect his reputation. So these are major figures in the Southern Baptist Convention that did not undergo any scrutiny in the Guidepost report, which failed to find the epidemic of sex abuse and sex abuse cover-up in the Southern Baptist Convention. Number 3, my third most favorite chapter is Chapter 1, Climate Change, Sneaking Past the Watchful Dragons. Now, this chapter tells the story of how evangelicalism was hijacked, or not hijacked, about how billionaires hijacked and created these organizations to get evangelicals on board with the climate change agenda. This agenda ultimately failed thanks to the heroic stance taken by Cal Beisner, who is painted as a hero in the story. In fact, of all the contemporaries, Cal Beisner seems to be the biggest hero in the story, in the entire book. He's the biggest hero. A lot of past heroes are brought up in the book, but he is perhaps the most reiterated current hero. And you'll love to see some positive examples like that. This is the chapter that Gavin Ortlund is called out in. And it's also the chapter where she talks about the origins of the misuse of love your neighbor in order to peddle a liberal agenda. So you hate to see that. But that is indeed what has happened with evangelicalism. We've been manipulated by the love your neighbor legalism, but that started with the issue of climate change, and I think that story alone is worth the price of Megan Basham's book. So number 2, Gracious is Chapter 5, Gracious Dialogue, How the Government Used Pastors to Spread COVID-19 Propaganda. This chapter rips Francis Collins open. Now, this chapter begins with I don't want to say hilarious, but it begins with an anecdote of Francis Collins standing up Megan Basham for an interview that they had scheduled. Now, he stands her up. Very unprofessional how he did it. Very passive-aggressive and, kind of a douche move. But that's the story. It's a pretty entertaining story to Megan Basham's credit. But this story calls out, and I'm going to name names here, Tim Keller, Rick Warren, N.T. Wright, Russell Moore, and Ed Stetzer as the 5 people who promoted Francis Collins, the evil Francis Collins, the most in evangelicalism. They are called out in this book multiple times in a list as people who promoted Francis Collins. And I think that is very useful. People are trying to debate Tim Keller's legacy. Well, Tim Keller endorsed Francis Collins, who's a terrible person, and endorsed his ministry, compared him to Daniel in terms of public service. This is an unacceptable stance for any supposed believer to take. It's just an evil stance. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. And that is what these 5 men, if you would call them that, did. This chapter was very good, very necessary. I am here for the Francis Collins hate. Number 1, favorite chapter, Chapter 8, None Dare Call It Sin, LGBTQ in the Church. Now, I wouldn't use that term, and I talk about that in my book, but this is my favorite chapter in the book. This one goes hardcore after Tim Keller. There are very few people, there are a handful of people that can match my knowledge on the side B theology, the history thereof. Jared Moore is one of them. I want to say John Harris is another person. And Megan Basham is on my level, and what she was able to show me, and I could probably show her some things too, but what she was able to show in the book was Tim Keller's compromise on homosexuality, which is something I've known about, but she just details how compromised Tim Keller was on homosexuality, advancing this agenda, and it's just evil. The idea of peddling side B theology in the church, which is what Tim Keller was largely doing, she goes after him hardcore in the book. You'll love to see that. She also exposes how Matthew Vines became a thing and the money behind Matthew Vines, who's one of the most prominent affirming pastors, if you would call him that, out there. So those are my thoughts on the book. Uh, those are the 8 chapters, in my opinion, ranked. Obviously, I have a perspective of being in the evangelical media fight that heavily weighs how I rank those chapters, but those are my favorite chapters, those last 4 especially. But anyway, that's all I got to say. That's my official review of Megan Basham's Shepherds for Sale. I recommend it. I endorse his book. And that's all I got to say about that for now. My name is Ray, the Evangelical Dark Web. Have a blessed day. Stay based. Christ is King. And we will catch you on the next one.